Learning any language behind a screen or mask is a challenge. ESL teachers are in most cases the first contact of newcomer students to their new Canadianness. And in the real situations, and our ESL teachers do their part to help the learners to better integrate into our communities. I've heard stories, I have contact with ESL teachers in all sectors, and I have seen their efforts helping their learners.
The very first thing that teachers need to remember when they meet these students is that they are human. They have probably lived through tremendous trauma, but that does not define them. Their human essence is within them. And I think teachers need to understand as well that sometimes it doesn't matter how much you speak somebody else's language, but we can all communicate as humans. Like, there's a vast array of human language that's nonverbal.
I think that when teachers are working with students who've arrived in Canada as a refugee, one of the things that they need to understand is that their students' experiences may be very different from what teachers have experienced themselves. And that may cause the students' reactions to be quite different, and it might also make it difficult for students to learn in settings that teachers are used to teaching in.
Teachers need to establish a relationship before the backstory is revealed. And I think what teachers ultimately need to understand is that these students have a vast potential, and we need to address their academic needs first and foremost. That's our job.
So one of the things I think is important when teachers are in that situation is to find out as much as they can, while still respecting the student's privacy, about the student's background, experiences that they've had that may make it difficult for them to be in the classroom, and also for teachers to try to reach out and learn about teaching people who may have suffered trauma or who may be dealing with culture shock, to look at resources, to talk to people who've had those experiences, and to try to reach out and bring that knowledge into the classroom so that they can work with it every day.
When students first arrive in Canada as refugees, I think first and foremost teachers need to understand their social emotional needs and perhaps have some recognition of where they're coming from. And also to understand, I guess it's easy to fall into the trap when they come, oh, they don't have English or they're missing this in their schooling. So sometimes it's easy enough to focus on what they don't have already and focus on the deficits. So really, I think teachers should also make an effort to focus on the assets that they bring and, you know, their life experiences that they have to offer and the multiple languages that they probably already speak, even though they're just learning English now.
Well, I think whenever you're teaching anyone, you really need to know their starting point. So for myself as an ESL teacher, I think it's really important to assess them, find out where they are in terms of language in English. So once I find a starting point, I know where they're going. And it's also important to find out their literacy in their own language, if they have any skills in literacy. But sometimes I think that it's not learning, the language initially when they first come is not always the most important part. Part is to make them feel comfortable and welcome and happy to be learning English and be here in Canada.
I think we're in a unique situation living in Newfoundland and Labrador because it's such a small island, and typically in the past there hasn't been a whole lot of diversity within the classrooms and within the schools. So fortunately for us, that's changing, and the landscape of our classrooms is changing as well.
A typical LINC ESL student profile, it can be a little tricky because we have adults here. So I've had students in their late teens and I've had students in their 80s. So our students can be quite diverse, but they do have some things that are in common. They are all adults. They are the majority of the clients during the years that I've been here, and I believe even possibly all of them now, although I'm not sure, but the majority are refugees. So they will be bringing experiences with them that might make it difficult for them to learn. And of course, if they're coming to Canada to settle, they're dealing with the experience of coming to a new country, and if they're refugees, that may not necessarily have been entirely their choice. And so they're dealing with all of the things that come with that. And of course, if they're at our school, they're trying to learn English as an additional language or to refine their English. So they do have those things in common.
There is no typical learned student profile because refugees can be anyone. They can be a child who's never been to school before to a child who has always been to school at a private institution and had access to the best quality education wherever they were could provide. There is no single typical student. It's a vast array of humanity and abilities because all humans are driven to be refugees. It's not a special sector within a population usually. So those kids could come from any kind of background, a very literate background or a very illiterate background. But again, I really think that if you just meet the children where they are and just teach them, not judge them, just teach them, then you're on the right path.
Anyone could be a learned student if they have gaps in their education. And for example, the Syrians, when they came here, they were educated, but there were times that they were out of school for 3 or 4 years, so they have gaps in their education.
For these kids, after going through what they have experienced before they came to Canada, and they normally appreciate very much what Canadian societies have provided for them, and they are grateful to our teachers, to our society, our communities, and they're ambitious to succeed in a new country. What they lack is not ambition. What they lack are opportunities, and they need support. And together, they need a lot of support, and not just in terms of learning academic courses, but also support in many other ways.
You have to be very careful in terms of how you question them. I really am against picking at them and asking them all questions about their life history. I think that needs to be revealed at the time that's right for the child. But you have to think about what can trigger these children. And you have to then select your materials very carefully in a way that's not going to trigger anybody who has been exposed to trauma. It's creating a very loving, caring, comfortable teaching environment where the stress level is low, where there's no sudden sounds or anything that can be frightening, because so many people with post-traumatic stress disorder have a real hyper arousal and a real exaggerated startle reflex. So you have to be careful of that. But I think also what teachers need to really remember is that a lot of children who have been exposed to trauma, they will manifest behaviors that most teachers will immediately say, oh, this child has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or this child must have a learning disorder. Because your cognitive function is really impacted by trauma. And a lot of these kids, for the first 1 or 2 years that are in Canada, like I find I can't get them to retain information. So it's this constant going ahead and coming back, going ahead and coming back, and constantly reviewing. But then for a lot of these kids, after about a 2-year period, it's like suddenly there's enough English language, there's enough settling of the central nervous system and of cognitive function that they start just blossoming from there. So I think teachers need to also remember that, they should not be quick to judge that these kids have some kind of cognitive disability when really it's trauma has that impact on memory retention and memory functioning.
Just because a student isn't learned doesn't mean they're not quite capable of participating in the classroom. And the one good thing is now teachers are more aware that they're using visuals, explaining vocabulary, doing a lot more group work.
So the transition to online teaching for COVID-19, that was very interesting. Of course, it was, as I think it was for most teachers, it was very abrupt and somewhat unexpected. I found that for myself and my students, it grew as the experience went on. At first, I have some students who are quite technologically adept, but I have some who are still really new at that and really trying to learn. So I wasn't quite sure at first if I'd be doing, if I'd be able to get much, far beyond like telephone calls, and we're mailing out or delivering packages of information. But I did, we started with that and we did videos, and I did find that there were some things that worked really well. For instance, one thing that I hadn't really thought about, but is something that I'm going to continue with my practices now, is the one-on-one time I got with students when we were video chatting. And that I found quite valuable. I got a chance to interact with my students in a different way. I did find it took some time for some of them.
When transitioning to online teaching was quite a challenge for most of us because our students didn't have the technology. And now we know better. When we know better, we do better.
For a lot of families, though, they didn't have the technology. They didn't have the expertise to use the technology, even if they had it. So a lot of those kids just sort of went down extended vacation mode. But there were some students who were really motivated, who engaged with the technology immediately.
So when COVID-19 first caused the shutdown, first and foremost, the major challenge was having technology and getting technology into the hands of the students. And once that was covered, then it was getting them able to use the platforms that we were using to be able to connect with the teachers and to get into their Google Classrooms or attend a Google Meet. They weren't even sure sometimes of their passwords for their email addresses. So those technical pieces were certainly a challenge. Once that was covered as well, I guess the biggest challenge for me was to not have those casual interactions with the students and to have those social engagements, because language learning and literacy learning is so social. So without having those opportunities to drop in at recess or after school, I think you really had to make that communication with the students more intentional, just to keep them engaged.
A lot of these kids had already settled into vacation mode. They were up until 2 or 3 in the morning, sleeping all day. So by the time we were trying then to go online and to reach them, they were all sleeping during the day when we wanted to have classes. So that was a challenge.
That was a learning curve not only for students, but for teachers, including myself. But now going into hopefully not the second wave or the next time we're faced with the pandemic, we'll do a lot better because I have a Google Classroom set up. I have my students already on. They know how to log into the computer. So once they have that access to technology, it will be easier. But it was really challenging. There was no off time. That I didn't finish work at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock or even 5. I was working late into the night preparing and learning things myself about how to improve my online teaching.
One thing that I think I could have done before that would have made the transition easier, and I'm trying to do it now that I have my students back in class, is getting them to use their phones in class. We work a lot with Chromebooks. We have a computer lab, and also we have Chromebooks that come to the classroom. And I didn't fully realize how challenging it would be for some to make the transition between, say, logging into their email on a Chromebook and logging into their email from home on a device that is where the login process is slightly different. Having gone through that with my students now, I do know that that can be a high barrier. So one of the things that I'm now doing in class is getting my students to use their phones to do some of the tech work. And that's something that I think might have made the experience better for them, and hopefully they'll benefit from us doing it now.
In classrooms, when we wear masks, again, we can probably resort to technology to help us while our facial expressions cannot be seen. We can use something else to complement the teaching. You need to see the facial expressions and the way people pronounce words. So learning a language without seeing the face is difficult. But for our learners online with the technology, I think we can be more creative in adding visuals, animation to our online learning platforms.
I also had some like drop-in hours or social hours, we'll say. Social hours were always well attended, but what I realized was that there were some students who needed more contact, and finally I said, come whenever you can, and if people show up, we're going to be at specific levels on specific times and dates. But if people don't show up, whoever's already online, I'll just go to their level. So I had some students who almost came 10 hours a week, and they did phenomenally well because it was almost ideal small group English language literacy instruction for the entire time, and their reading abilities just skyrocketed. That was awesome.
So some teachers would purchase dictionaries for their students out of their own pocket. Other teachers offer their cell phone numbers to students in case of an emergency situation and students need help. And yet more teachers offering a lot of extra time after class and offering a lot of advice to their students as to how to respond to what situations. And they help their students fill out forms, and they offer advice on many different fronts.
One of the things that probably the most difficult for me is how close I am with students and working in our rooms, in the small rooms we work in. It's really hard to keep a distance, and like they're so used to being able to hug and get close, and when you're teaching a language and speaking with kids wearing masks and things, and I keep saying, what did you say? So some of that's quite challenging. And just moving around the school, because I work in 5 different schools in the city, in Metro St. John's, so moving around to different schools. And at some schools they'll ask me, please call before you come, and we want to have a room ready. We don't want teachers wandering through the school and having visitors to the school, because essentially in some places I may be only there once or twice in a cycle.
As a faculty member, I supervise quite a few doctoral and master students. During the COVID time, at the very beginning, it was very hard for my students, and I completely understand their sense of isolation and their anxiety over the social distancing and the lack of directions as to how to respond to such a situation. So what I did differently, slightly differently, is to increase my meeting time with the students. Instead of my regular biweekly meetings with each student, I increased it to meeting with them every week. And I also did something slightly different with the format of meeting. Instead of a one-on-one meeting, one after another, and I turned it into a big group meeting at a longer duration. So my students were able to see each other on the screen at the same time for a longer period, and that way we created a small learning community. So students get to hear what their peers are doing and get really interested. And so that way they know what others are working on, and then that give them more motivation to do well in their part. So as a matter of fact, I stressed on the mental and physical health of my students, encourage them to go out, do some exercise when it's possible, and maintain their physical health. And meanwhile, to remain connected with their family, friends, and with me as a supervisor and with their peer students. So I stress the mental and the physical health. As a result, my students actually achieved better with their academic work, and they all completed their work successfully and feeling happy and feeling the sense of connection with each other.
One of the first things that teachers need to do is slow down in their delivery of speech. We live in a province where part of our cultural ethos is how rapidly we speak and how many very idiosyncratic Newfoundland expressions we have. So you can't be teaching these students speaking a mile a minute or including all of these really typical Newfoundlandese statements or any kind of idiomatic language. So you need to make your language very clear and be succinct. So slow down, be clear, be succinct.
So while they're home during COVID, to help increase their language skills in English, I think it's really important to expose themselves to text. It could be text of any kind. So if they have books at home or books online that they have access to, or even watching television and reading captions, I think that's very important. So there's a strong connection between text and language learning, and also finding opportunities to engage socially if they can. So if they have friends outside, they can social distance with and play and have those social interactions with, and connect with teachers on Google Meets. Sometimes students didn't see a purpose in that, but if teachers give them engage them and make them interested in joining, I think that it's beneficial, even if they don't want to participate in the meet, even just to be there and to hear their classmates and hear the teacher speak. I think that they should try and take any opportunity that they can to listen to English and to use the English skills that they have.
I think right now, with everything that's happening with COVID-19, one of the things that students can do to try and help improve their study of English is to try to look for opportunities to practice. They may not have as much in-class time as what they had in the past. And so looking for opportunities outside of school where they feel comfortable practicing, like trying to seek out maybe speaking to people in the grocery store a little bit more, or taking time to try and figure out the words and some of the signs you see at the mall. Or trying to engage if you're at a level where you're comfortable having social conversations, trying to engage people a little bit more when you reach them, when you meet them. I think that's something that students can do, and I think that one of the things that we can do as teachers is try to help when we do have time with them to facilitate that and to find out what students are comfortable with and interested in and what they could pursue on their own. So for instance, introducing students to websites that might have some language practice, but also be areas of interest that they might want to learn about on their own time. Trying to help make sure that students have access to the technology that they need to access things online. Helping with students who are at learning, lower levels of English. So things that we could do for the future in terms of physical distancing. That's interesting because I have my class having come back. I've kind of been doing a bit with that. What I'm finding is a lot of organization and a lot of labeling. I cleared out the back of my classroom. We don't have lockers here, but I made sure that every student has their labeled spot so they can all put their books away and take them out and nobody else is touching them. Also things like I I was trying to figure out, like, how do I distribute materials without, how do I collect materials without everything getting mixed together? How do students, you can't really share things unless they're in the same cohort, or bubble, which I don't always necessarily know. So I've been doing things like, classroom supplies like pencils, colored leads, numbering things, and giving students, make sure each student has a plastic baggie with their name. And so things like that, like students they have their number, they know that they get the number 7 dictionary, the number 7 crayons, the number 7 maps. And then if we're going to be using something for a while, they can keep it in here, which again goes with their things. Nobody else is touching it, and then I can clean it once when we're finished the unit or they're ready to move up to the next level, as opposed to having to clean it every day. And things like having, a blue folder for things they want to give to me, and then they put it in their folder, and then I can look at each folder individually instead of having a big pile of everybody's papers where all the papers are touching, and then another folder for things they want to take home. So trying to sort of organize the physical space of the classroom.
There's a lot students can do to improve their language at any time, during a pandemic or non-pandemic times. Normally, I'm not a big proponent of watching TV or watching movies, but watching English television, watching English movies, I think it's very helpful. Also, you can have the closed captioning on, so you can see the words as well as hear them. That really helps.
Some of the links that I've given my students, and making a Bitmoji classroom and a Google Slide classrooms, has helped students, so they have access to a lot of sites with vocabulary, a lot of sites with reading now, and listening to books, and just getting excited about learning and finding out what their topics that they're interested in. So if I know a student who loves sharks, for example, then I'll find different books on sharks, and then I'll find ways to introduce that vocabulary. So once you know the students well, and you know what they love or what their interests are, it is easier to get them excited about learning language.
There's a lot of protocols in terms of public health that we're trying to follow and make sure that the students are aware of. And yet we still want school to be a welcoming place. I know that for some students, it's a very important part of their new community here and helping them feel socially connected. So figuring out how to balance that, make sure that people are safe from a public health perspective, and also making sure that we still have a school community, that we're still able to connect with each other as classmates and coworkers and members of the Link School community. I think that's going to be here at our school, I think that's going to be a challenge, and one that something we're going to be working on, and hopefully we'll be able to meet.
I really do try to encourage them to develop friendships with English speakers, because that's what they need. They need to be practicing English socially, but to practice academic English, they need to read. I tell them read. Read as much as you can. Read whatever you can get your hands on. We have several apps that they can use on their phone or whatever, and they need to read. That's where they're going to find all these words that they need for their academic work. They're not going to normally hear those in conversation. They've got to read and create little personal dictionaries.
I think going forward, we need to ensure that students have equal access to resources and the curriculum. And we also need to ensure that any systemic barriers that our students face are resolved now before the next wave of something new comes. And I think if we think about equal access and reducing systemic barriers, we'll do a lot better next time around.
TESL NL is an association for teachers of English as a second language in Newfoundland and Labrador. Newfoundland and Labrador is the eastmost province in Canada. We're a small province with a smaller population and a smaller newcomer population as well. And we are a small association, yet we have been growing in the past few years. So we invited our experienced teachers to share their strategies coping with the new situation, And we encourage our teachers to engage in discussions to how to cope and how to work with their learners. And we share learners, and we'll try to engage our broad K to 12 and teachers as well as our communities to be aware of the challenges of our students and our ESL teachers. So raise awareness of the entire society, of the broad community. That's one of our goals in future. I think our ESL teachers have been doing a great job supporting our ESL learners here.